At approximately 1:55 in the morning on April 1, 2006, a 27-year-old medical student was standing outside a bar near Ohio State University. His name was Brian Shaffer. He had been drinking with friends. He had spoken to two women. He appeared to be having an ordinary night. Then Brian walked back toward the entrance. And that is where the record becomes extraordinarily difficult to explain. Security cameras captured Brian around the building. They captured him entering the bar. They captured him shortly before 2 a.m. but there is no confirmed surveillance footage showing him leaving. Not walking down the escalator. Not walking out the main entrance. Not appearing on the surrounding cameras that investigators examined. And when the bar closed, Brian wasn't there. His friends couldn't find him. His car remained at his apartment. His belongings were still there. 3 days later, he was supposed to fly to Miami with his girlfriend. He never arrived. 20 years later, Brian Shaffer has still not been found. The FBI continues to list him as a missing person. Columbus police continue to classify the case as open. So what happened between the moment Brian disappeared from that camera's view and the moment his family realized he was gone? And perhaps the most difficult question of all. How does a person disappear from a building that appears to have cameras watching its exits? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Brian Shaffer was born in February 1979 and grew up in Pickerington, Ohio. By 2006, he was 27 years old and studying medicine at Ohio State University. He was not a person whose life appeared to be heading toward disappearance. He was a medical student. He played guitar. He loved Pearl Jam. And he had a girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner. The FBI's original vocabulary described him as a medical student and guitar player and noted identifying details including a Pearl Jam tattoo on his upper right arm. But the weeks immediately before Brian disappeared had been difficult. His mother, Renee, had died only weeks earlier after battling myelodysplasia. That loss would later become an important part of the story because investigators and people close to Brian had to consider whether his emotional state might somehow have influenced what happened. But there is an important distinction here. We know his mother had died. We know Brian was dealing with that loss. We do not know exactly what Brian was thinking on the night he disappeared. Any claim about his private mental state beyond what was documented would be speculation. And there was another reason people expected Brian to be somewhere else a few days later. He and Alexis had plans. They were supposed to travel to Miami for spring break. There was a future already scheduled. Then came March 31st. Classes had ended. Spring break was beginning. And Brian went out. On the evening of March 31st, Brian spent time with his father, Randy. Later, he met up with his friend Clint Florence. They went out around the Ohio State campus. Eventually, the two made their way to the Ugly Tuna Saloona. At the time, the bar was located inside the Gateway complex near North High Street. This location would become one of the most important places in the investigation. Because investigators would eventually discover something unusual about the building's surveillance system. But that night, there was nothing about Brian's behavior that necessarily suggested he was about to disappear. He was with people he knew. He was in a public entertainment district. There were cameras. There were other businesses nearby. And there were people everywhere. At some point, another friend, Meredith Reed, joined Brian and Clint. The night continued. Then, shortly before 2 a.m., Brian was captured on surveillance. The footage showed him outside the bar area. He spoke briefly with two women. Then he moved back toward the entrance. That would become the last confirmed visual record of him. And this is where the timeline becomes strange. Brian did not immediately disappear from existence. He disappeared from the available record. There is a difference. The camera simply stopped showing him. Imagine the scene. The bar is closing. People are leaving. Brian's friends eventually come outside. They expect him to follow. But Brian doesn't appear. His friends wait. They look for him. And eventually, they make an assumption that would later become painfully important. They assumed Brian had already left. Perhaps he had walked home. His apartment was only several blocks away. There was no immediate reason to think anything terrible had happened. He was 27 years old. He was an adult. He had been drinking. And people sometimes leave bars without telling their friends. So the night ended. But Brian never arrived home. The next morning, Alexis tried to reach him. There was no answer. At first, that was not necessarily alarming. Someone who had been out drinking could sleep late. But as the hours passed, the situation became more concerning. Brian's phone went unanswered. His girlfriend eventually went to his apartment. His car was still there. Nothing immediately suggested that Brian had packed up and left for an extended trip. Then Monday arrived. Brian was supposed to leave for Miami. He never showed up. At that point, the possibility that this was simply an ordinary night followed by an ordinary morning became much harder to maintain. Brian was reported missing, and investigators went back to the last place anyone could confirm seeing him: the Ugly Tuna Saloona. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage, and what they saw created the central mystery of the entire case. The cameras showed Brian entering the area around the bar. They showed him later that night. And shortly before 2 a.m., they showed him outside, talking with two women. Then he moved out of the camera's field of view. There was no confirmed footage showing him leaving the building afterward. That distinction matters. The footage does not prove that Brian never left the building. It proves that investigators did not have surveillance footage showing him leaving through the monitored route. The building also had a service area that investigators considered as a possible alternative route. That meant the famous question: how did Brian leave? Was never as simple as saying there was literally no possible exit. There were other possibilities, but none produced a confirmed answer. Investigators examined the building. They searched surrounding areas. They examined other surveillance footage. And the disappearance became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the ordinary assumption that Brian simply walked home. The problem was not just that Brian was missing. The problem was that the last known evidence seemed to place him inside a very specific location at a very specific time. And then the trail stopped. The investigation expanded. Search teams looked around the Gateway complex and nearby areas. Investigators considered the surrounding construction areas. Searches were conducted around locations that could potentially have concealed evidence. Other surveillance footage was examined. The investigation did not simply stop because the cameras failed to show Brian leaving. But nothing produced the answer investigators needed. There was no confirmed body, no confirmed sighting, no verified explanation for where Brian went, and no definitive evidence establishing that he had been abducted, murdered, or voluntarily disappeared. That last point is important. Over the years, countless theories would emerge. Some involved accidents. Some involved foul play. Some suggested Brian had somehow managed to leave the building without being captured on camera. Others suggested that he intentionally disappeared. But a theory is not the same thing as evidence. And after 20 years, the case remains officially unresolved. Then there was Brian's cell phone. This became another source of mystery. After the disappearance, the phone was repeatedly called. Usually, according to reports, it went directly to voicemail. Then months later, something changed. In September 2006, Alexis called Brian's number and heard it ring instead. For someone waiting for a missing person, even something as simple as a ringing telephone could feel enormous. But the ringing did not establish that Brian had suddenly answered his phone. Nor did it prove that he was alive. Reports about the phone and cellular network have produced confusion over the years, particularly regarding the difference between calls appearing to ring and actual cell tower activity. The FBI's official missing person material does not present the September ringing as proof that Brian had resurfaced. And later reporting has described the ringing as likely related to a network or routing problem rather than evidence that Brian was using the phone. That distinction is crucial, because the disappearance has generated so many theories that individual details have sometimes become larger than the evidence actually supports. A phone ringing is not proof of life. A tower record is not automatically proof that Brian was physically holding the phone. And an unexplained technical event does not become a breakthrough simply because the case desperately needs one. Still, the phone became another unanswered piece of the puzzle. As the years passed, theories multiplied. One possibility was that Brian had left through a route that wasn't captured by the primary surveillance cameras. The service store theory received attention because the area around the bar was under construction at the time. If Brian had used a route associated with the construction area, that could potentially explain why he was not captured on the normal exit footage. But it would also create another question. Why was there no subsequent confirmed trace of him? Another possibility was an accidental death. Perhaps Brian left the bar, entered an area where he could not easily be seen, suffered an accident, and ended up somewhere investigators failed to search successfully. This theory has appeared repeatedly in discussions of the case. But again, it remains a theory. There is no confirmed evidence establishing that Brian died accidentally. Then there is foul play. Could someone have harmed Brian? It is possible. But no person has been convicted of killing him. No body has been recovered. and there is no publicly established murder sequence that explains what happened. The case therefore presents an uncomfortable problem. The disappearance is suspicious. But suspicion is not proof, because Brian disappeared while out with friends. Attention naturally turned toward the people who had been with him. His friend Clint Florence was one of the last known people with Brian. Another friend, Meredith Reed, was also there. That does not make either person responsible. It simply makes their recollections important because they were among the people who could provide information about Brian's final known hours. Over the years, public discussion surrounding the case has sometimes focused heavily on Clint. But the fact that investigators questioned someone, or that the public scrutinized someone, does not establish guilt. There has been no conviction establishing that Clint Florence killed Brian. This distinction is essential in an unsolved case. A documentary can examine why investigators considered certain people relevant without turning suspicion into accusation. And that is particularly important here because Brian's disappearance has generated decades of internet speculation. Some theories have become so familiar that people repeat them as though they were established facts. They are not. The two women Brian was seen speaking with shortly before disappearing also became part of the investigation. Their significance is simple. They were among the last people known to have interacted with Brian. But again, being near a missing person is not evidence of involvement in a crime. Investigators needed to establish what happened during those final minutes. What was Brian saying? Why did he walk back toward the entrance? Did he meet anyone else? Did he leave through another route? Did something happen after the camera stopped recording them? Those questions are more important than the dramatic theories that later grew around them. Because the real mystery isn't that someone on camera looked suspicious. The real mystery is that the available evidence stops. The Brian Shaffer case is ultimately a problem of time. We know approximately where Brian was. We know approximately when he was last seen. We know where his friends were. We know when the bar closed. We know he did not return home. We know he missed his planned trip. But somewhere between those points, an enormous gap exists. And that gap is where every theory has to live. If Brian left the building through the normal route, why wasn't he captured? If he used another route, why wasn't he subsequently identified? If he remained inside the building, where did he go? If he was abducted, where's the evidence? If he voluntarily disappeared, how did he manage to leave without producing a confirmed trail? Each possibility solves one problem and creates another. That is why the case has remained so compelling. It is not simply mysterious. It is structurally incomplete. The evidence gives investigators a beginning. It gives them a last confirmed sighting. And then it gives them silence. In 2021, the Ohio Attorney General's Bureau of Criminal Investigation and Columbus Police Division released an age-progressed image of Brian and appealed for information. The official notice stated that Brian had been missing since April 1, 2006, and identified him as 27 at the time of his disappearance. Today, the Ohio Attorney General's missing person database still lists Brian as missing. The current listing gives his age as 47 and continues to request information through the Columbus Police Division. The FBI continues to maintain a VICAP missing person entry for him. That means this is not merely a historical mystery archived in the past. It remains an active missing person case. And that changes how we should understand the story. Brian is not simply a character from a 2006 mystery. He is still missing. After 20 years, it is useful to strip the story down to the facts. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old. He was an Ohio State medical student. He went out with friends near campus on the night of March 31, 2006. He was last confirmed seen in the early morning hours of April 1. Surveillance footage showed him around the Ugly Tuna Saloona. He was seen speaking with two women near the entrance area. He then moved out of the camera's view. There is no confirmed surveillance footage showing him leaving through the main route. His friends eventually left without him. He did not return to his apartment. His car remained there. He missed his planned trip to Miami. He was reported missing. Searches and investigative efforts followed. No confirmed explanation for his disappearance was established. No body was recovered. And no one has been convicted for his disappearance. Those are the foundations. Everything else must be measured against them. We do not know exactly what Brian did after his last confirmed sighting. We do not know whether he left the building through a route that wasn't captured. We do not know whether he met someone after leaving the camera's view. We do not know whether an accident occurred. We do not know whether someone intentionally harmed him. We do not know whether he voluntarily disappeared. And we do not know where Brian is today. That uncertainty is uncomfortable. Because most investigations eventually produce a narrative. A body. A confession. A suspect. A conviction. A documented escape. Something that allows investigators to close the circle. Brian Shaffer's case never received that final piece. There is a tendency, when discussing a case like this, to focus on the impossible-sounding phrase. He walked into a bar and vanished. But that phrase can actually obscure the real problem. Brian did not literally disappear in front of everyone. There was a sequence of events. There were people. There were cameras. There were buildings. There were exits. There were phones. There were searches. There were investigators. There was evidence. And somewhere inside that ordinary collection of things, something happened that has never been reconstructed. The cameras did not solve the mystery. They made the mystery more precise. They gave investigators a final visual window. And then they gave them nothing beyond it. That is what makes the case so difficult. Not that there was no evidence, but that the evidence appears to stop at exactly the point where the explanation should begin. For Brian's family, the uncertainty has its own kind of permanence. A confirmed death, however devastating, eventually answers one question. An unsolved disappearance leaves another question alive indefinitely. Where is he? What happened? Could he still be alive? Did he die that night? Was someone responsible? Did investigators miss something? Every possibility carries a different kind of pain. And because there is no confirmed ending, there is no clean emotional conclusion either. Brian's family has had to live with a story that never reached its final chapter. On April 1, 2006, Brian Shaffer went out with friends. At some point during the early morning hours, he was captured on surveillance. Then he disappeared from view. 20 years have passed. The technology has changed. The building has changed. The people who were there that night have grown older. But the central question has remained remarkably simple. Where did Brian go? The official record gives us no definitive answer. The FBI still lists him as missing. The Ohio Attorney General's office still lists him as missing. And Columbus police continue to seek information. There are theories. There are suspicious details. There are unexplained pieces. But there is no confirmed conclusion. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember about Brian Shaffer's disappearance. The mystery isn't a supernatural story. It isn't proof that someone can simply disappear into thin air. It is a real person's unresolved disappearance. A young medical student left a bar one night, or perhaps left it in a way investigators never managed to establish, and somehow the trail went cold. For the people who loved Brian, the story did not end in 2006. It simply stopped. And somewhere beyond that final frame of surveillance footage is an answer that, after 2 decades, investigators still have not found. Brian Shaffer is still missing. And until that changes, the question remains. What happened after the camera stopped watching?